A plan to close and consolidate schools in Duval County is moving closer to reality, and with it, some hard truths about the economic and racial makeup of the schools targeted for erasure. Two Jacksonville Today reporters joined forces to dig into the present situation and the city's not so distant past. Megan Mallicoat, education reporter, joins me now. Good morning, Megan.
Morning, Nan.
And Will Brown, race, inequality, and poverty reporter, also at Jacksonville Today. Hey, Will.
Good morning, Ann.
So this was there was a lot in this story. I thought it was really well researched and very compelling, but there's one fact that really stands out from it, and that is that 4 of the 6 schools slated for closure in Duval County are more than 90% non-white and in economically vulnerable neighborhoods. Will, there is something about that that is maybe not terribly surprising.
Surprise, surprise. Uh, when we looked into this, it didn't surprise me as a Duval DCPS parent uh, to see some of this. In some of these schools, it's not just that they're a majority of Black and brown students. It is that these are communities where students walk to school every day. So, moving a school maybe 1, 2, even 3 miles, it might not seem that far, but to someone who walked in a community where there may or may not be, where you might have to cross over a 4-lane road, that's a big difference.
Yeah. And so this has been a contentious topic from the beginning, Megan, but remind us a little bit of the process that got us here.
Yeah, so it's not a new conversation. Really, the current iteration started with former superintendent Diana Green's plan 5 years ago. But when construction costs soared after the pandemic and things got really expensive, they could no longer build as many schools as they'd planned. And so the district is looking now for more ways to save money because the state requires a 3% reserve fund, and the district is getting really, really close to that threshold. They've had to spend, I think the figure is something more than $30 million over the last couple of years. And so now they're very close to the state taking over finances, and so they're looking for ways to save money. And a lot of that honestly comes with saving or with closing schools because many of the schools are now under enrolled. Some of that comes from when they built the schools; they built them to be small intentionally, and now the district likes to operate schools that are 700 students plus, just to break even with operating costs.
What's the philosophy behind the initial desire to build smaller community schools?
Well, that probably goes back to some historical education best practice, but some of it also comes from the fact that they were building segregated schools in the 50s and 60s. So the district operates 153 schools right now, and about half of them were built during that post-war World War II baby boom. Um, and they were small neighborhood schools. And even though Brown versus Board of Education was 1954,
70 years ago, yes.
70
ma'am.
years ago, yeah. Duval, like many districts in the South, continued to build white schools and Black schools for at least another 10 years. And so some of those schools you see are very close to each other now in neighborhoods. And you can just kind of see the lingering
Because
impacts
one was
of
the white
that.
school and one was the Black
Correct.
school.
Correct.
So, I mean, to dial back though to the beginning of this effort to close and consolidate schools, initially, because a lot of the schools in the district are old, the goal was to close some of these schools, but also build a bunch of new schools. And what you're saying is that is no longer part of the equation, or
Right. So the first
less.
half is still there. The closing schools is still there, but the building of new schools is not as much. And so some of that too comes from some of the changes the district has seen in recent years, and the enrollment overall is kind of down. Some of that perhaps comes from the exit path to charter schools and private school vouchers. But yeah, so instead of building a whole bunch of new schools and at the same time closing some, the closing some is the part that's still on the table.
And because the district has been dipping so heavily into its reserve funds, it's reaching that state threshold of 3%. And at that point, the state could take over the district's finances and
That's
operations.
that's what the district spokesperson is telling me, right?
Yeah. So, Will, what is the argument for closing these 6 selected schools?
Well, the district says that they want to, quote, right size the district. And like Megan mentioned earlier, some of these schools have less than 300 students. Some have even less than 200 students. And so to close some of these schools would allow them to move. The district has said, we want to close the schools where you could literally pick up the whole population of the school and put it in a separate school that's nearby. And so that's why they chose these six, which on its face, you could understand that. I spoke with a longtime educator within the district, um, and she mentioned that, when you look at it from a pure financial standpoint, it is equitable, but the context is what is has so many people a little bit concerned
What do
about
you
the
what do
process.
you mean by a financial standpoint it looks equitable?
Well, so the long-term educator I mentioned, she told me that, uh, when the school district is making these considerations strictly from a dollars and cents perspective of, okay, well, this school's under enrolled, this school's nearby, it makes sense to kind of consolidate them so that we can save money. It makes sense. At least that's what she explained to me. But when you have the context of some of these schools are very walkable, whereas other schools may not have students who walk. They might be bused. They might have their parents take them. Or some of these schools, I think Susie Tolbert's one that is potential for closure. Most of those kids walk to school, and there's no easy way to get to the school that would, I think it's Biltmore. There's no easy way for people to get from Susie Tolbert to Biltmore because you have to cross railroad tracks. So, those are things that's the context that we're talking about here.
If you're just joining us, I'm talking to Jacksonville Today reporters Will Brown and Megan Mallicoat about their new story that looks at the proposed closures of several elementary schools in Duval County and the concerns that those closures are raising. Um, One of the perspectives that this story raises, Will, is a historical one. And it's hard. I mean, as Megan alluded to, it's been a number of years since Brown versus the Board of Education. This particular county, like a lot of other counties in Florida, was very slow to accept um, a desegregated model, and in fact was under court order for a number of years to enforce a desegregation order from the court. And it was only in 1999 that they were finally declared unitary, right? That they were considered no longer actively segregating populations.
And if you want to understand how close 1999 was, that was the year I started high school. So it was not that long ago. And if you want to understand just how recent some of this is sometimes up at the dais, Duval County School Board member Warren Jones will just mention offhandedly, "Oh yeah, that was during segregation," or "That was because of segregation," or some of his experiences were, "Oh yeah, that was when schools were segregated." And it's so, I mean, and Warren Jones is alive and well, and will be one of the people who decides whether these schools close. And there are thousands of people like Warren Jones floating around this town who can remember when Duval schools were, segregated openly, and it took some doing to get back to it, to get close to where they are now. With not too long ago, the NAACP wrote an op-ed where they mentioned the history of segregation in local schools as for why they first called for a moratorium of school closures in districts 4 and 5, school board districts zone 4 and 5, which are north side, east side, parts of the west side, which majority black and brown, are predominantly black and brown. Um, and so that history is at the forefront of a lot of the people who have lived here for an extended period of time because they've seen it or they've heard it firsthand from people who did experience it.
And as you said, the NAACP has asked for a moratorium on closures. Isaiah Rumlin, the president, has called for a much deeper conversation about this, Megan. And so it is a conversation that the community is having. But how much of that conversation is happening at school board meetings?
Um, so some of the school board members, particularly board member Pearson and Coker, have called attention to the fact that context is important here, and it seems like at least there's a perception of the schools that are really loud and have these advocacy groups and have time to, make T-shirts and signs and so forth, have come off the closure list, whereas some of these other schools that we're talking about today haven't had the same kind of advocacy groups form. So some of the board members have drawn attention to that and asked that the board, take the context.
Because when these school closures, there was many more of them initially proposed, and schools like Atlantic Beach Elementary and Fishweir had very well organized, very visible parent groups that were
Right. So
protesting.
the closure list has been through a few iterations, and the one that came out in the late spring, early summer was the one that included several schools that are predominantly white, like heavily, heavily white, much higher than the district average. And those schools were the ones that had the advocacy groups form, and they did a great job of um, vocalizing the role that their school plays in their community and the impact that it would have to close the school on their community for many of the same reasons. In many cases, they're walkable schools that are at the heart of their neighborhoods. And it is not that different from the schools that we're talking about now. The major difference is that they had people, vocalize their concerns.
And Will, you talked to Tiffany Clark, who is leads a community group, a parents group here in town, and she wanted to make a point about why that was.
Yes, and she's a volunteer with Parents Who Lead, and the people she's spoken to says they don't begrudge the Atlantic Beaches and the Fish Weirs of the world. They just want the district to listen to them the same way they listened to those other schools. But also, at you know, Tiffany Clark has been to barbershops, salons, laundromats. A lot of different third spaces where people go. And it's not that they don't want to be up at Prudential Drive, but
At the school board
yes,
quarters.
oh, you're right. But if someone's a longshoreman, they don't have time to spend 20 hours a week following the school board when their job is heavily dependent on being out on the docks for very long periods of time. And that's just one profession, but I just know with certainty that there are longshoremen who have children at some of these closing schools who would love to. They advocate for their children by financially supporting their children.
Yeah, but they are people in some cases who work hourly jobs who may not have transportation. It
Yes.
makes it harder to either get to the schools or mass the resources to do things like make T-shirts and signs.
Yes.
Yeah, we've got a call from Charles on the west side. Good morning, Charles. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. I was wondering that should these walkable schools get closed and we're required to resort to busing, with all the problems that we've had the past couple of years with having enough buses available and whatnot, where's the busing money going to come from?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if these schools meet the threshold where they would be required to provide bus transportation. I think that what is that, like a mile?
So it's a mile and a half, and we got the data on, I think it was at 3 schools that are considered right now 100% walkable schools, that they call them walk-in schools because all of the students live within that 1.5 mile radius. And then if you look at the schools that they're being consolidated into, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, those schools are actually farther away than a mile and a half. So it would seem that just mathematically, it seems then like most of the students who were walking to school will now qualify for bus transportation. Some of them won't, but they'll have a where they might have walked 2 blocks before, they'll now have a 1.4 mile walk or something across very traffic heavy situations that you wouldn't necessarily desire to put a 6 or 7-year-old in.
And to your point, at the consolidation meeting that we attended at Cedar Hills Elementary earlier this month, a couple of people mentioned were very sensitive to the fact that there was a young woman who was a student at Ed White High School who was unfortunately killed by a motorist this year as she was crossing a street, and that was a high school student. And one person specifically mentioned to me that they knew that her family knew of that young girl's family, and their concern for high schoolers was it might not be safe for high schoolers. It's 100% not safe for elementary schoolers. And to some of your reporting, Megan has mentioned that the school district's going to invest more on crossing guards, but some of these parents and groups are like, you need to do more than that.
I thought one thing that was really interesting in your reporting was looking at, the condition of some of these schools. Megan, as you pointed out, some of these were built specifically as Black schools. Kind of putting that in air quotes, but this was during a period when we were supposed to be desegregated and in fact weren't. But the condition of the schools is partly due to the corners that were cut during construction of these schools in a deliberate way that has contributed to their condition.
That's right. I had a lot of fun digging through old articles from the Florida Times-Union, and one of my favorite examples that came up was an article about George Washington Carver Elementary, and it was just a kind of a rundown of what the school board had talked about the prior day, and it was that they chose to save about $10,000 at the time by using a different kind of steel and eliminating some of the covered walkways and taking out decorative features like gardens and an intercom system, which at the time I would imagine was kind of a high tech thing. Um, so yes, and I have heard that anecdotally as well, is that in some of these other schools that were built initially to be the so-called black schools, that now they're not in as good of shape as they could have otherwise been uh, because of the way that they were built.
And for instance, the steel that they chose was a more corrosive type of
Right.
foundation. Yeah. Um, so, Will, I guess there are some in the community that feel like history is repeating itself in terms of um, the burden of the school closures falling disproportionately on a segment of the community, and just a resource diminishment for that same section of the community when it comes to educational needs.
There is a frustration that uh, since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the percentage of white students in Duval County has declined, while the percentage of black students has remained constant, but yet it is overwhelmingly black students and Latino students who are facing the brunt of these closures. That is a frustration from some folks that we spoke with for this story, that it's, why is it this part of town exclusively? Uh, and there might be other schools that close down the line, but there seems to be a perception that this is supremely unfair, that these are the schools that are initially closing, and or in the case of Rains High School, it's like, we don't know if you're going to do right by us because we've seen what's going on with some of these elementary schools.
Yeah. We've got a call from Stanley. Good morning, Stanley.
Yes, good morning to everybody. Yes, our research showed that it's poor leadership when it comes to the school, uh, in the African American schools in the African American community. As she said before, when it comes to Fishware and a few other schools, they are organized. They are working together. You do not have that in the African American community in Jacksonville. Jacksonville leadership, regardless of education, business, or whatever, is dead, and that's that's part of the problem. Thank you.
Thanks, Stanley. What happens next, Megan? I mean, there's a meeting tonight. How close to being a done deal are these proposed closures?
It's pretty close, honestly. Tonight, there's a public hearing for each of the 6 proposed closures and then one additional non-elementary school closure. Um, and then the school board will vote on Monday at its regular meeting. Its regular meeting is on Monday this coming week instead of Tuesday because of the election.
What time is that?
6 p.m.
Okay.
And
Well,
to that point, one person I spoke with mentioned that even the timing of the consolidation meeting the day before one of the most consequential elections in American history shows just how, in their perception, just how little the school board cared about the weight of the decision that they're about to make.
well, it's an important conversation. It's really important reporting, and I thank you both so much for doing it and for coming on to talk about it. Will Brown, Megan Mallicoat of Jacksonville Today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ann.
Thank you.
All right.